Hello, everybody. I am going to make a video on Chapter 14, Late Medieval Art in Italy. There is a little bit of review for some of the things that are relevant for those of you who did not take Art 114, which the Renaissance will refer back to. So I'm going to give a couple images in these slides so that you'll have things to compare them to. So we are in the years around 1200 to 1400, and you'll recognize Italy by the boot here. Um, and most of the things we're going to look at are in northern Italy, and then a little bit more north later on. Um, this time period is often considered the beginning of the Renaissance rather than the end of the Gothic era. And certainly some of the artists we look at start doing things that are really popular in the Italian Renaissance. So we'll talk about that. This idea of humanism is taking place in Europe at the time, um, and that's in this as well. Humanists will look back at ancient texts and philosophy and math. Um, and this will be the revival that will happen in the Renaissance, but it does start happening in this late Gothic time period. The first sculpture we look at in the chapter is the pulpit of the baptistry from Nicola Pisano, who lived in Pisa. And he sort of invented this structure, a pulpit that is highly decorative. And then you can see the ladder in the back there. That's where the priest or bishop or cardinal would, walk up, and they would be on top so they could oversee the service in the church. And you can see that there are things that are directly taken from ancient Rome and Greece. We have columns, and on top of the columns are these acanthus leaves, which are considered to be the Corinthian order in ancient Greece. Um, and then we have these trifoil designs, these scalloped designs. And then on top are these panels, and this is relief. Carving relief is when it is projected off of a surface, and this is the one that we look at in the textbook. This is two different stories happening, both of them with Mary as the main player. So we have on the left, we have Mary in the Annunciation scene, and the Annunciation scene is when the Archangel Gabriel comes and announces to Mary that she will bear a child. She will conceive a child with the Holy Spirit. She will be infused with this, and she will give birth to Jesus. And we can see here that Mary looks a little hesitant. She's pointing to herself as if she is doubtful. Are you talking to me? Um, and she's having a very human reaction to a spiritual situation. And this is important to note because this is sort of what the foothold of humanism taking place, where it's human centered rather than just spiritually centered. So we have people acting and reacting in a true human way. And then the center scene is Mary in the Nativity, and you can see her baby Jesus has already been born over here, and then all the animals and things that would have been around the manger. And here we have the baby being washed. Some of it is missing, unfortunately. So this is a typical Gothic device of telling two stories in the same thing. Mary's right next to Mary, and this is obviously to save space, but also, it's the cycle of life for Christ. This whole thing. So this is the infancy cycle. And just to show, like, if you weren't in 114, um, the evolution of how things come to be. This is a very early Christian sarcophagus, so it's just like a grave, or coffin. And you can see the proportions here. We have gigantic heads, we have shortened legs. Nothing looks quite right. Um, and then this is very late Gothic, or I should say mid Gothic, where figures are very elongated, or they sort of stick to the shape of the column. So they're not very naturalistic, right? Neither one of these is very naturalistic based on the actual natural form. But earlier, this is an ancient Roman relief sculpture on the Areopagus. This is what sculpture would have looked like before the early Christian, Romanesque, and Gothic is Greek and Roman art. So if you didn't take 114, here's your little review. Things were very much naturalistic, um, in proportion, if not idealized proportions. Drapery, was flowing. Of course, the Greeks and Romans were okay with nudity, which the Christians won't be yet. But you can see that this is something that will be revived, and it is already happening with Nicola Pisano. And here's another Roman sarcophagus as well. And of course, these types of things would have been all over Italy, where the Roman Empire was, and it was actually everywhere. But they would have, Niccolo Pisano would have been able to see some of these things, or these way of doing things that he could very much, go ahead and imitate. So he's already in the late Gothic. We already see artists turning back all the way to ancient Rome rather than to um, styles that were just previous to their own. This is another great example of a Gothic cathedral where there are two different styles happening right next to each other. We have here the very Gothic elongated column-like figures. This is both these scenes. This is the Annunciation scene here. There's the angel telling Mary, and you can see she has not much reaction whatsoever. She's not very humanistic. And then on the right is a little bit later style where we have these two figures. This is Mary and Saint Anne, the Visitation, where Saint Anne is pregnant and Mary's also pregnant. And they're standing very much in this pose with one knee relaxed, this contrapposto pose from ancient Greece and Rome. And they're very naturalistic drapery that goes, it goes with their movements rather than stays, vertical like a column. And their faces look more individualized than the figures on the left, who look very, otherworldly or spiritual. So this again is showing that the things that are going to happen in the Italian Renaissance have already started happening in the late Gothic age. What else is happening? In 1378, we have the Great Schism in the Catholic Church, and the outcome of this is that there are two popes, one in Avignon, France, and one up in Germany, which means a lot of area, including Italy, has this gap, this lack of representation of a leader in the Catholic Church. And it's this time that monastic orders of monks, seem to gain power and prominence around Italy. There is a group called mendicants. And if you're a mendicant monk, that means that you have walked away from all of your worldly possessions and goods. You don't believe in ownership, and you rely on the goodwill of other humans. They're called begging friars, so they're looking for donations. Um, and one such mendicant monk was Saint, who eventually became canonized as Saint Francis, who was said to come from a very prosperous family, and he renounced all his possessions. It said he actually just um, gave his father everything he had and said he didn't want it anymore. He wanted to live a life of poverty. And he joined an order, the Franciscan order, and he was named after them. And he was canonized later on, rather than it says recently, but that's in this time period, not in our time period. He was a saint for a long time. Um, but we can see here this is the altarpiece from Berlinghieri, a an Italian artist, a late Gothic artist. This is what Gothic painting. This is a little bit more advanced than some Gothic painting, but it holds on to the Gothic traditions in the way it is shown. We have Saint Francis with his column-like body. Right? He's not standing very naturalistically. If anything, he's on his tippy toes there. There's no, you know, his feet don't seem to touch on the ground. His fingers are very pointy. And then we have all the scenes of his preachings and things around him. But we do see this idea of modeling or shading on his face and his palm, a little bit on his feet. But this gold flat background is a very Byzantine and Gothic tradition that Berlinghieri is working in. And that is because the gold is supposed to be this spiritual place rather than an earthly place. So there's no desire to show realistic space. And I'm pointing this out because soon that will change. And here's the close up of the scene where he is preaching to the birds. The birds are representing the impoverished. So not only the Dominicans, they were poor, their whole goal was to help the poor. And we see that they have the gold background, which holds on to Gothic conventions, and then the way of showing perspective. This part of the building is flat to us, so it looks like it would be 1 point perspective. However, these things just go horizontally rather than at an angle. And when we get to the Italian Renaissance, I will explain exactly how perspective works. Some of you probably already know. This roof should go down to a point somewhere on the horizon rather than just straight across to nowhere. These should both be angled down since we're looking up at them. Scale wise, these figures are as, nearly as tall as the building. They're column like. There's lots of shading though. Berlinghieri was really trying with that. And you can see this mountain here is very abstract, right? It's just a series of shapes with some shading. So the idea of going back in space, is it supposed to be going back? Is it going up? Berlinghieri does not care to show realistic space. He cares to show the holy story that is being shown, which is really what Romanesque and Gothic art was doing all along. Cimabue, who comes after Berlinghieri, this is his Madonna enthroned. He takes a little step forward with his trying to show humans more realistically and also space more realistically. He does break the space into different segments so that these old prophets down here are in one space, but they do interact with the space above. So we have Isaiah and Jeremiah here down below looking up at Mary, who sits enthroned in a much larger scale, so hierarchical scale. That means it shows order of importance. And Mary sits with Jesus. She's pointing to this is the Savior. And then we have all of the angels around just kind of stacked up. They don't go back in space, they just go up vertically. Nobody's getting smaller. They do overlap, but never the faces or the halos. So it's a very compressed picture, as if the picture plane was like a piece of glass. It's as if everything's sort of like pushed forward with a just a flattened gold background. But Cimabue is trying his hand at perspective here. And he does a pretty good job with the throne. We see the two different angles here and some angles here. So he's observing the way humans actually see things that have corners and lines go back in space. It He won't solve it yet. That won't happen until later in the 1400s. So maestra just means the panel that has the mother here. And when you see the word Madonna, that means my lady. In the Gothic age, it was called Notre Dame, Our Lady. That was French. Now we have the Italian version of that. Um, so we have the stacking up. Some of the angels gaze out at us. They're interactive. Um, and we have this, the men below. This is Cimabue sort of comes up with this, sort of registers with them interacting. It's not a separate part of the story. They are part of her story. So in the 14th century, lots of other things happen after the schism. The Black Death is going to hit Europe in the 1340s. And unfortunately, it's going to wipe out many, many, many people. That's an astounding percentage there, 25 to 50%. And it's in this time people are going to become even more religious. They're going to really need to pray in their minds more. And so wealthy people are commissioning even more devotional images, altar pieces, giving money to the church. And Italy starts to produce books in a common language, which is Italian and not Latin. And that's important to note because even though more people are being educated and more people can read, still a very low percentage of literate people, though, a lot of people still can't read Latin. You have to have a very, very proper education to read Latin. But most people who would read would be able to read Italian. So it makes these books more accessible to people. And the books being produced, a lot of them were um, about or copies of classical things like literature and philosophy, scientific things. And this goes with humanism. With humanism comes education, and individual potential is the other part of humanism. It is said that Cimabue was Giotto's teacher, and Giotto is the artist that is thought of as the in between artist, the gateway to the Italian Renaissance. Sometimes he is put in the Renaissance, and sometimes he is put at the end of the Gothic chapter. He's actually in both of my courses, 114 and 115, because you have to understand Giotto to see how things are going to change, how things were and how they will change. So this is his Madonna enthroned. And you can see he has a much more voluminous Mary. She has volume. She seems to have depth. She's round in form. You can see the drapery here, even though it's dark. You can see her knee kind of poking out. Same thing with the angels here. Everybody seems to be like a solid figure in a space. He's still using hierarchical scale, right? The idea that Mary should be the biggest in the work of art makes sense. She is the most important. And instead of just stacking up his angels, he's trying to show them going back in space. He overlaps their faces. In some case, he cuts them off. And these figures look like they're behind these figures rather than on top of them. And also his modeling and shading, you can see, the shadows on the necks, especially how the face is sort of sculpted with paint, and then the shadows down here as if it's very 3D. Same thing with Mary. So Giotto is actually observing the way that space is projected and also how light is hitting three-dimensional things and trying to capture them with shading. Berlingeri was doing that as well, but his seems a bit like the paint sits on top rather than sculpts the form. Giotto's also experimenting with perspective. He's showing how figures overlap more naturalistically. And then this part of the throne, we're looking up and we can see into this as if it's a three-dimensional space. This isn't quite right as far as perspective down here on the bottom, but he's getting closer to how things actually project in space. And this is a comparison between the master teacher on the left there, Cimabue, and Giotto on the right. And you can see his Mary is much more grounded, much more human looking. And of course, that goes with humanism. And so are the angels. The big thing we look at Giotto in this chapter is the Arena Chapel, and this is a big shot of it. He was commissioned to paint this by the Scrivani family, a wealthy family in Italy, or Padua, I should say, is where he is from. And I put this here. I showed this in the seated class, the Khan Academy. There's three different videos, and it really does go through these very well and explain a lot of things about this. If you want to go and see that, it's the Khan Academy. If you just put Khan Academy Giotto, there's like three different ones. I show one and two because they go over some of the things that are in the chapter here. Um, and you can see he uses this blue color. I'll talk about that in a second. So it looks like the sky or the heavens with medallions on it. And then he's divided all these scenes. It's supposed to be read top um, around to the top, and then you go down to the next register and around the whole chapel and then down. So top, right to left, second, right to left, bottom, right to left. So it's the cycle of Jesus's life. So this is the one we have in our book, The Entry into Jerusalem, and this shows different like sort of movements. Giotto has learned how to make the human form look very three-dimensional, and so he's finding different ways to do that. And here he's showing a man taking off his garment. This one's taking the thing over his head, and then this one is. Uh, Giving a cloth at the foot of Jesus, who's just come into Jerusalem. So it's like three different time periods. But really, we look at this because of this elbow sticking out. Giotto is experimenting with this thing called foreshortening, where something comes or goes quickly in space so that it looks distorted, right? If you have an arm, somebody has their arm at their side and you're drawing it, that's like typical proportions, it's expected. But if they lift up their hand and it's like the hand is in your face, their arm becomes suddenly, very short. It looks very distorted. So Giotto is observing the human form and figuring out how to draw it realistically in different positions, and this thing called foreshortening, and he becomes quite good at it. Um, and all of the figures have very humanistic qualities. They all have different expressions. These people up on the top right, this woman actually looks like she has anticipation on her face or reverence down here on this guy's face. And he is attempting perspective with all these angles here. And this, here's the word, lapis lazuli, which is a very precious blue stone, which comes from the East, Turkey and beyond. Um, and it's also called ultramarine because it refers to the idea that they're over at the sea. Um, you have to grind this pigment up and use it in the fresco, and it's really expensive. So he uses it. Um, as much he can, and this will indicate or this will reflect the wealth of the Scrivani family who paid for this. Like people who would see the blue, they would know it was an expensive painting. This is the Lamentation, the one we focus on in this course. And the lamentation scene is when Christ's body has been taken off the cross and he is held by Mary. So we'll see this scene again in other artists. Um, but Giotto's version here is doing a few things. One is he is showing the backs of people in sort of a framing device around Christ so that our eyes can sort of settle on him. And that's a visual device, of bracketing that artists use to control the viewer's eye. And so we look here at Christ and Mary, and she's looking very human, with all of her angst. And then these figures are also having human reactions as well. But I point out this framing device because these figures are faceless and he's showing their backs, which is kind of a strange thing in painting of this time. It's because he's not bothering to include them in the story. They're there to just sort of frame Christ. They're not players in the story in a way. So he's doing that. He's doing all these faces. Um, and he's doing this space. We just look at Berlingary's mountain that goes completely straight up vertical instead of back in space. So Giotto's using angles, which is part of perspective, to show things going back in space, and it seems to be getting smaller as it goes. So that is a correct device. That is linear perspective. This other thing where these mountains are and they're hazy and you can't really see them too much is called atmospheric perspective. This is a natural way of seeing things. We don't see everything in the distance clearly. Things get fuzzier and smaller when they go back. And when things get fuzzier, especially in a landscape, we call that atmospheric perspective. And then the other revolutionary thing is this idea of foreshortening that I just talked about. And you can see all the angels here are in different poses. They're coming and going, like forward and back, so that Giotto can show that he knows how to do this thing, foreshortening. And then he makes this guy's arms. I always think he's trying to fly or something, but he's really just sort of like reacting in pain or something with his face. You can see, but Giotto is showing foreshortening there as well. You can see a little closer here. So there are your terms there. There's the foreshortening. And then we have perspective, we have atmospheric, that's that haziness. And then we have linear perspective, which is when things that have use lines at angles to show things going back in space. And the other scene we look at is the portrayal of Christ, again with the backs sort of framing the main people. And the betrayal of Christ is when Jesus and Judas come face to face, and it's also called the kiss of Judas, where they encounter each other after Judas has betrayed him, as Jesus has foretold in the Last Supper. And Giotto does a whole bunch of things in here. He's using all of these sticks to sort of create all this chaos, the chaos of the scene. People are left and right coming towards each other. So it's going to be a clash of Judas and Jesus. And here is a close up of their very human expressions. Um, we see Christ kind of staring down Judas, and Judas really staring back at him as if he's might be saying, forgive me, or searching him for forgiveness. So Giotto in his own time was very famous because of all these things he could do, the idea of perspective and modeling of figure. Um, but he was also used often by wealthy people because he was really talented at doing this thing called trompe l'oeil, which is a French term for trick the eye. And we're going to remember that because Michelangelo is going to use this as well as are many other artists. Um, Raphael will use it in the School of Athens as well. And the tricking of the eye is all of these panels here that look like marble or tile, like all these framing devices. They are just fresco. Those are not actual marble. He is tricking the eye into in a material way. He's trying to make it seem as if these are very, very expensive panels. And of course, fresco and paint is much it's plaster, so it's a lot cheaper than marble. Um, so this saves the Scravini family a lot of money. So he's they're indulging in the blue azure paint or the blue lapis lazuli, but they are saving tons of money by using Giotto, who is so good at this fake stone stuff. And just to compare the beginning painting, the Berlingeri, with this is Giotto's version of Saint Francis here, and you can see how Berlingeri has his almost like floating, and how grounded Giotto's is with his roundness of form. You can see the knee shape through the drapery here as well, his use of perspective. Well, Giotto was very famous up in Padua, and as it happens in Italy, there's towns and cities are often very competitive. We'll see this again with Florence and Rome. Um, so Siena wanted to have their own Giotto when they find uh, the artist Duccio, who is their answer to Giotto. And this is Duccio's version of Mary enthroned the Maestra, the mother. And he uses a lot of the same visual devices that Giotto did. You can see he's just as good at modeling the figure, making it look 3D, a rounded form. He is overlapping his figures. He does not overlap their faces as Giotto did. So he doesn't quite take that step, but they do have a lot more room than just stacked up straight vertically. They seem to be in space. Still hierarchical scale, that hasn't gone away. And he's using the device that Cimabue was using as well with these extra registers of figures. In Siena, Duccio was very famous. So this is his the altarpiece that this is on, and this is a gigantic altarpiece that's has all these panels front and back. And here's the back of the Maestra. And we're going to look at one in particular, but I put this in here. You don't have to read the whole thing. It was so famous that all work closed when this was going to be moved in pieces to the church. Everybody stopped, and there was a giant parade, and they were so proud to have this work of art. So this is the entry into Jerusalem, one of the panels. And it's a strange altarpiece because you have to kind of go zigzag to figure it all out. But people who would have viewed this would have understood like the it goes in chronological order of Christ's life. So they would have been able to follow it. And here we have Christ coming in. And Duccio is, he's getting pretty good at perspective. We have, the angles seem almost right. Not all the angles go to the same vanishing point. This one seems to go here, but this building over here goes way off into the distance. But he seems to be understanding a little bit of perspective. And then the Christ taking prisoner. Again, we have different episodes. In the center is the kiss of Judas. And we're going to compare that to Giotto. To the left, we have Peter cutting off the ear of the servant. And to the right, we have the flight of the apostles. And just like Giotto, Duccio is showing very human actions and human reactions in his art. So here's a nice comparison with the Giotto and the Duccio. You can see the Sienese people were probably very proud to have him. He's a good version of Giotto. Very humanistic. And then here's the human reaction. This is similar to the lamentation with everybody having like a very pained reaction to the situation, acting very human. And let's notice the feet, no longer the floating feet of Berlinghieri's St. Francis. People are firmly planted on the ground in realistic space. Siena also had the landscape um, painter, well, he painted other things, Lorenzetti. And this is seen as the biggest fresco landscape in the Middle Ages, paid for by these nine. They're called the Nine in Siena. They were nine wealthy people who kind of ruled everything. Unfortunately, Lorenzetti died of the plague very quickly. But this is one of his panels in the town hall. And this is called Peaceful City. This is a secular subject, meaning it does not have a religious meaning. And that's hard to find in the Gothic age. Even in the Renaissance, it's not that easy to find in Italy. And we can see Lorenzetti's really trying his best at perspective. Some things aren't quite right, but it's almost there. He didn't invent perspective, but he's doing pretty good. Some things are a little awkward, like this thing on the left. But this is almost like a moral lesson. The nine who commission it are in charge of the city. And of course, the effects of good government are, because of them. So they're sort of patting themselves on the back. This is a good city, and it's a good city because we have good government, and we're the government. So we have all different scenes of things that have to happen in a city for it to be good. You see people getting around, people doing their jobs. We have like sort of like nice pastelly, pleasant colors. And this is a detail. I like to show this because here we have a school, and then we have the cobbler here, and then we have um, what is this guy doing? He's like a deli or something. And people going about their business. We have people hurting animals. But the idea of education, well, that goes with this idea of humanism that is taking place, that education is now going to be a thing for people to aspire to get, to learn things. And those things that they're going to learn will be classical things, most likely. The peaceful country. So Lorenzetti is also using a little bit of atmospheric perspective here. So he's using both linear and atmospheric perspective. And the last thing in the chapter is architecture. So the Florence Cathedral. Earlier in the Gothic age were other things. The baptistry is earlier. That is a Gothic thing. But the whole cathedral was built in the late Gothic without the dome. That will happen in the Renaissance. Um, but I will point out that they built the whole thing without having a plan for the dome, and nobody could figure out how to build the dome until the Renaissance. And the problem, one of the problem, they created their own problem because ideally you design a building to hold a dome. You don't build a building and hope for the best that you can figure out the dome. And it takes a genius of the Renaissance to come up with a way to put the dome on a building that already exists. But these Italian marble panels are a very Gothic thing. Italy in general, there'll be a few buildings in the Baroque. Italy in general doesn't excel at architecture. That is a place for France to sort of do a lot of things, but they do excel at painting and sculpture. It said that they wanted to fit the entire population of Florence, and it is giant. It's like 3 city blocks big. It is a very big, but they didn't get to fit all the people in there. It didn't. It wasn't quite that big. But I will point out that the campanile, or the bell tower, which stands separately from the cathedral when you're calling people to mass or announcements, was designed by our artist Giotto earlier in the chapter. So this is another reason why people often think of Giotto as a Renaissance man. A Renaissance man means, you're good at everything. And so one of the key marks in Italian Renaissance, like Leonardo da Vinci, will be good at everything. He'll be good at science, math, architecture, sculpture, and painting. Not much sculpture, but he's good at certain types of 3D thinking. All right. And then if you, I'll just put this on the slideshow. In class, I show these two on how to make a fresco painting and paint with egg tempera, which is kind of important because very soon in the next chapter, we'll be looking at oil painting and why things look so incredibly different suddenly. And most of that is because of material things. Giotto starts this revolution with the idea of real figures in real space, and we're going to see that take off in the future. All right, that's it for this chapter. Thank you.